Okay, so I'm going to do another MOS changes video now, and I think we'll take a look at the Dwarves, seeing as someone mentioned them in one of the comments in the Harad one, because the Dwarves do have some more substantial changes than Harad, although it is still fairly minor compared to a faction like Gondor, but I will assemble their units and we'll take a look at them. Okay, so the Dwarven roster is in front of us, and they have 5 new units, which is a pretty substantial amount considering that they are actually 5 quite useful units, at least in the context of how good they are. The problem with Harad's units is they didn't really add anything to the faction, and the Dwarven units, they strengthen what was already there, and they also add something, but I'll get onto that a little bit later on in the video. For a start, we have the miners. Now, of course, they haven't really changed. They're still a low-tier unit. They have got some decent survivability to them in MOS because of the way that the mechanics of this work. But they still have the problem of being low-tier, and low-tier is a little bit of a problem in MOS, but, you know, we'll move on because balance is not really a thing that we can look at in MOS with too critical of an eye because it's not really terribly present. We also have the Iron Crossbowmen. Again, they'll do largely the same thing, similar to the Axe Throwers, although the Axe Throwers have got a slight missile damage buff, which means they are maybe slightly more useful, but still you're not likely to see them online if you're against the Dwarves or playing as them, because you probably want to spend your money in other areas. Dwarven Axemen, still, they're still in the Dwarven roster, and they're still pretty decent, but again, it's really the higher tier units where we're going to be looking at what the Dwarves have that is new. Vault Wardens and Dwarven Halbermen are still the only 2 pike units that the Dwarves have. They're still, very good. The Vault Wardens in particular, because of the newfound survivability of a lot of the units, are indeed very, very effective in MOS if you use them correctly, although pikes are more difficult to use in MOS, at least in my experience. They seem to buck a little bit easier, but the Vault Wardens get around this by being very tough and survivable due to their armor. The Dwarven Warriors, of course, very basic tier infantry. You're not likely to see these guys simply because you're more likely to see the higher tier variants. The General's Bodyguard, of course, the Dwarven Noblemen, less in the unit in MOS, but they are still individually very, very elite. Now we come to the units that are new, at least 2 of them, and the first one is the Hammers of Gundabad. What these guys are essentially is an anti-armor unit, which is better than the Axemen of Erebor. They are pretty darn good, and I believe this is a unit that is going to be included in Third Age Reforged, which I'm glad of because this is my favourite new Dwarven unit just because of the look of them. Hopefully it'll be a little bit better balance there because of course it is a little bit tricky to balance things in Third Age, but nonetheless, they are still a very good unit to use as the Dwarves. It basically just adds to their heavy infantry superiority. Picture them as a more heavily damaging, slightly less survivable Dragon Slayer unit, and that's what the Hammers of Gundabad are. They're also pretty cheap for the mod, although the mod does undercost quite a lot of units, and they also have 152 in the unit, which is always nice. Then they have the Dwarven Wanderers from Ered Loon. These guys are interesting. They're not particularly good individually next to something like the Guards of kazad-dum, but they can hide anywhere on the map, which is fairly unique. It's a feature that wasn't really on any unit in the base version of the mod, but it's not particularly useful in online because as soon as the enemy comes near you, which is what you want them to do as the Dwarves, they're just going to see them anyway. Maybe you can put them out wide and surprise a few enemies, but it's not really going to work too well. Individually, they are still pretty good because they are, of course, Dwarven infantry. They're a fascinating unit to try and blend into your army, I'll admit. But again, I can see them being pretty cool to use in single player. Same with the Hammers of Gundabad. So that'll be quite interesting if you go for that. The Guards of kazad-dum, of course. Now, across the board, the Dwarves have this philosophy of having higher defense than attack even in vanilla, so basically that's been exacerbated in MOS. And the Guards of kazad-dum, they have a lower attack at 6, but their defense is now over 30, which means they will take a long time dying. They're one of the few units that does have the cost increase after just 1 though, so that's a strange instance of balancing, at least in the multiplayer sense in this mod, so that's quite interesting. The Iron Guard, again, much more defense than in the base version of the mod, slightly less attack, but they have more defense, so they're even harder to kill, as with most units in the mod. Of course, we have the Axemen of Erebor, still very good despite the fact that the Hammers of Gundabad have been added. Then we have the Mattock Warriors of the Iron Hills, another new unit. They're another anti-armor unit, but they are basically worse in every way than the Hammers of Gundabad, and yet they are more expensive, significantly more expensive, which again is an instance of the MOS submod being rather unbalanced for multiplayer. They're still a cool looking unit though. They're essentially a 2-hander version of the Iron Guard. So I like the look of this unit. I just find it a shame that the balancing is kind of off. Nonetheless, still a good unit to use. Again, pretty similar to the Hammers of Gundabad, so it's another higher damage unit with an anti-armor capability. The Wanderers are really the only new shielded unit that Dwarves have, and they add a little bit of an element of surprise to your army. You also have the Dragon Slayers, again, anti-armor, but a bit more survivable anti-armor than the Matuk Warriors, the Axemen of Erebor, or the Hammers of Gundabad. They'll do largely the same thing that they always did. And we have the Bjornings. Now the Bjornings are a unit which many other factions have. I don't really see the use for them in this army, however, because there are so many units which do this job better. In fact, I think they are worse than the standard Dwarven Axemen. So if you're not going to use the Matuk Warriors, the Axemen of Erebor, the Hammers of Gundabad, or the Dwarven Axemen, maybe you can use these guys, but they're really redundant. Perhaps the most important addition, though, is over here. We have the Dale Cavalry, of course, which was a Dwarven unit in the initial game. They were, the fact that they were in the Dwarven roster, you wouldn't use them a lot in multiplayer because they'll get massacred by other cabs. You may as well just bring more infantry. But they now also have Riders of Dale, and this is essentially an 8th Wodia Horse Guards unit, which is a fascinating addition to the Dwarves because it gives them a cav unit which can actually compete at the high level, which means the Dwarves are now, it gives them mobility which they didn't have in the base mod, which was really their only major weakness, in my opinion. So I like the units that MOS adds to the Dwarves. They are, not sweeping changes like they are with a faction like Rune, but I like the individual changes. The Hammers of Gundabad are my personal favourite. But I think the balancing again is the problem with MOS, and it is true with the Dwarves. If you're going to play them online, you really need to set your own custom rules so that you can't just bring all the best units. Otherwise, if you're going 1v1 against the Dwarves, you're going to be in a lot of trouble against all of this infantry now. Because before, the Dwarves had 3 heavy infantry units which were very, very elite, and they were able to sort of swamp you with just those, but now they're able to bring even more. So it is going to be a bit of a problem if you try and balance it, but if you balance it, it can be fun. So that is the Dwarves. I would say the Dwarves have been noticeably improved. I would like to see the Hammers of Gundabad, the Matuk Warriors, the Wanderers, all those units included in 3rd Age Reforged, because they are cool looking units and I would like to see a more balanced version of them. I know that the Hammers of Gundabad are one of these units, but I'm wondering if the others are as well. But I look forward to going on to the next faction for the MOS changes, and I'm thinking it will probably be a Kingdom of Men, a good Kingdom of Men, maybe Arnor, because Arnor have perhaps had the most sweeping changes in MOS, at least in terms of how much more power they've been given, and that's really the best video for which I can showcase why MOS is so unbalanced if you just have standard multiplayer games against random people in which you have equal money. So I'll do Arnor next. I'm not sure when that video will be out, but I'll try and get it out as soon as possible, and I hope to see you there.